In the spring of the year 44, Herod Agrippa arrested James, the fisherman who had left his nets on the shore in Galilee, and had him put to death with a sword. He was the first of the 12 to be put to death for it, and his is the only one of those deaths that the New Testament stops to tell us about, in a single verse with no detail at all. Years earlier, James and his brother John had come to Jesus and asked to sit at his right hand and his left when he came into his kingdom. And Jesus had asked the two of them whether they were able to drink the cup he was about to drink. They told him they were able. James was the first to find out what he had agreed to. Everything else the church knows about how these men finished, it knows because it remembered and went on remembering and eventually wrote it down. These are those stories, though he was not the first of them to die. That was the one who sold him. Judas carried his 30 pieces of silver back to the priests, told them he had betrayed innocent blood, and was told that was his own affair. He threw the money down on the temple floor and went out and hanged himself. The priests would not put blood money in the treasury, so they bought a burial ground for foreigners with it, and Jerusalem called that plot the Field of Blood from then on. Matthew tells how he died. Acts tells what was found afterward in the field his money had bought. In Jerusalem, the church was led for 30 years by another James, the Lord's own brother, who had not believed him while he was alive, and who became, after the resurrection, the steadiest man in the city. They called him the Just. Hegesippus, writing in the century after, says he was on his knees in the temple so long and so often that the skin of them had gone hard, like a camel's. In the year 62, with one Roman governor dead and his replacement not yet arrived, the high priest took his chance. They brought James up onto the temple wall in front of the festival crowds and told him to talk the people out of following his brother, and he preached his brother to them instead. So they threw him down. The fall did not kill him. He got to his knees and began praying for the men standing above him. "Father, forgive them. They do not know what they are doing." And one of them, a fuller, finished it with the heavy club he used for beating cloth. Josephus, a Jewish historian with no reason to flatter Christians, confirms it from the outside. The year, the high priest Ananus, the council he convened, and a man put to death as a lawbreaker. Peter went to Rome. In July of the year 64, fire took the city for 6 days, and when the rumors began drifting toward Nero himself, the emperor handed the blame to the Christians, and the killing started in the gardens and the arenas. There is an old and beloved story that his people persuaded him to slip out while he could, and that on the Appian Way he met the Lord walking the other way, in toward Rome, and asked him where he was going. To Rome, to be crucified again. Peter turned around and went back. He was crucified in Nero's city, and the story the church settled on is that he asked to be hung head downward, because he did not think himself fit to die in the same posture as his master. Long before any of it, on a morning beside the lake, the risen Jesus had told him that when he grew old, he would stretch out his hands and be carried where he did not want to go, a saying John sets down as being about the death by which Peter would glorify God, and which John, writing years afterward, knew had come true. 30 years on, the church at Rome wrote to the church at Corinth and named him among the great pillars who bore their witness and went to the place of glory. Paul was a Roman citizen, and Rome killed its citizens with a sword rather than a cross. So the tradition puts him outside the walls on the road to Ostia, beheaded in the same persecution. That same letter from Rome names him beside Peter. He had testified before the rulers, and then he left the world. He had seen it coming, and had written it down himself in a last letter to Timothy, that he had fought the good fight, that he had finished the race, that he had kept the faith. The young man who once held the coats at Stephen's stoning ended as a witness himself. Andrew, Peter's brother, went north and east and at last into Achaia in Greece, where the governor at Patras had him crucified. The account the church receives says he was tied to the cross rather than nailed to it, which meant the dying took far longer and that he went on speaking to the people who had gathered to watch him for the better part of 2 days. The X-shaped cross that now carries his name was given to him later by the medieval church that loved him, and it flies over Scotland to this day. Thomas went east farther than any of them. The old account has him carried into the service of an Indian king named Gundafar, building for him and preaching to his household, and finally run through by soldiers on a hill outside what is now Chennai. Europe had never heard of that king and took him for a storyteller's invention, until his coins began coming out of the ground in the 1800s, an Indo-Parthian ruler who really had held that country in exactly the years when Thomas would have arrived. On the Malabar coast, the Christians of Kerala have called Thomas their father for as long as anyone can trace them, and they call him that still. Philip preached at Hierapolis in what is now Turkey, and was crucified there, head downward, according to the account that came down. In 2011, an Italian archaeologist digging on that hillside uncovered a 1st century tomb with a church built around it in the 5th century, for no purpose but to shelter that one grave, reached by marble steps worn hollow by the feet of thousands upon thousands of pilgrims. Hierapolis had never been in any doubt whose grave it was. Bartholomew went to Armenia, and the church remembers him flayed alive, the death Michelangelo gave him on the wall of the Sistine Chapel, where he sits at the Lord's feet holding his own skin across his arm. For Matthew, for Simon the Zealot, for Jude, for James the son of Alphaeus, and for Matthias, who was chosen to take Judas's place, the church's memory is thinner, and it does not always agree with itself. Matthew is remembered in Ethiopia. Simon and Jude are remembered in Persia, killed together, and they have shared a feast day ever since. James the son of Alphaeus is remembered stoned at Jerusalem and buried beside the temple, and also crucified in Egypt, depending on whose account you have. 3 men in the New Testament are called James, and the early church did not always keep them straight. Matthias is remembered preaching east toward the Black Sea, and stoned and beheaded at Jerusalem, and in one old account simply growing old and dying. These accounts were set down centuries after the men themselves, by churches that had carried them by word of mouth in the meantime, and they come to us the way most family history comes to anybody, kept because it mattered to the people keeping it, not because someone was taking minutes. John is the one the church has always remembered differently. Tertullian says he was brought to Rome and put into burning oil, and came out of it unhurt, and was sent on from there into exile on an island, Patmos, where he saw the things he wrote down. He came back to Ephesus and grew very old. Jerome passes on what that church remembered of his last years, that his disciples had to carry him into the gathering, and that he no longer had breath enough for a sermon, so he said the same thing every time: "Little children, love one another." They asked him why that was all he ever said anymore, and he told them that it was the Lord's command, and that if it alone were kept, it would be enough. He died in his bed, the last of them. These men scattered from Rome to the Malabar coast, and one thing runs through every version of every one of these stories. Not one of them is remembered as having taken it back. They were not men who had been told something. Every one of them claimed to have seen Jesus alive after Rome had killed him. Paul, last of all, on the road to Damascus, and everything each of them did for the rest of his life came out of that. And once Rome had a settled procedure for them, it did not particularly want them dead. The one that survives in any detail is the one Pliny lays out for his emperor in a letter from the province of Bithynia. Give the man a chance to deny it, have him pray to the emperor's image with incense and wine, have him curse Christ, and send him home to his family. That last item is the whole of it. The way out was never paperwork. It was apostasy. Nero's crowd never got even that much. They were burning as arsonists, and no denial clears an arson charge. But wherever Rome went about it lawfully in the centuries that followed, the door stood there, and the offer came before the sentence. And the people who kept these accounts were the same people who kept the letters of men who argued with them, and the accusations of their enemies and their own founders at their very worst. Peter's denial is in all 4 Gospels, put there by the church that Peter led, and Judas is in all 4 as well. The church wrote its own betrayal into its scriptures and has read it aloud in worship ever since. It recorded the men who broke. What it never recorded, and these were the people best placed to know and the most careful about writing down every other collapse, is a single one of them taking back what he said he had seen. What they had instead was a memory none of them could put down, that the man Rome executed is alive and that he is Lord. They carried it to Greece and Armenia and India and into the city that killed them, and they died in those places, and the church that grew up out of their graves is still saying their names. Some of what we know about how they finished can be proved, and some of it has reached us simply because one generation after another thought it was worth handing on. Both kinds came down through people who believed what those men said they had seen, and what those men said they had seen is true. And the last word the church has from the last of them, spoken in a room in Ephesus by someone too old to stand, was, "Little children, love one another." He had been saying it since the beginning.